Saturday, June the 22nd, 1968. The Sidra of Shlach Lecha, from which we read today, describes how Moses, at the command of God, sends 12 men to spy out the land of Canaan. The children of Israel had endured 400 years of servitude in Egypt and had finally been redeemed. They had left Egypt under the leadership of Moses, crossed the Red Sea, and marched across the wilderness. They were now on the borders of the Promised Land. The chapters in the book of Numbers which describe the abortive spy episode are strange on any reckoning. Within the Bible as a whole, God is conceived of as knowing everything. He describes to Abraham in advance that his descendants will be slaves in Egypt for 400 years. This is all part of a divine plan which God had envisaged from the beginning and will see through till the end. What are we then to make of a God who is so ignorant about the conditions in the land of Israel that he has to instruct Moses to send out spies at the 11th hour to ascertain what the condition of the country is? Our reading from the book of Numbers in the Sidra of Shlach Lecha smacks of the realities of life and not of the idealities of a divine plan. Does not God know what resistance will be forthcoming from the Canaanites? Does he really need the human assistance of spies? Is the final entry into the promised land of Canaan dependent upon reliable intelligence reports? Is there no cosmic central intelligence agency? It is on occasions such as these, which we come across at frequent intervals in the Bible, that the human origins of this book become plainly evident, and the divine cosmic plan is clearly and visibly seen as a superimposition of a later date onto the raw facts of past history. Chapters of Numbers from which we read, which describe the episode of the spies, despite the fact that God is briefly invoked in the opening sentence, is as realistic a chunk of history as any you will find in a modern textbook. This is the way men behave in reality in the absence of a God sitting on a cloud who is able to foresee and tell them what is going to happen in the future. When ordinary men living in the world as it is wish to conquer a country, they don't pray, they send out spies. And even the manner in which the spies are selected betrays what I choose to call the humanistic, the naturalistic dimension of our reading from the book of Numbers today. The selection of the spies is shrewdly done on a democratic basis, one for each tribe, and not on an aristocratic or an oligarchic basis, which characterizes so much of the rest of the Bible. In the rest of the Bible, it seems as if the authors are always interested in who your father is, whether your grandfather is a high priest or something like that, or whether you were born in the right bed. But suddenly, when the chips are down and there is a crucial matter of a battle in the offing, the selection is made democratically, one spy for each tribe. And this again measures up to what we know about the realities of life. It is always in the presence of crisis, especially a crisis such as war, that the democratic principle has to assert itself if the group as a whole is to survive and meaningfully identify itself with the purpose of survival. 2 world wars in England did more for democracy than all the liberal speeches in the House of Commons put together. For not until the world wars did the aristocracy find that they needed the lower classes, so-called, and in the interest of its own survival, both in the case of the First World War and the Second World War, it miraculously held out a helping hand to the so-called lower classes to join the ranks of the upper classes. Their brains, their hands, their brawn, and their skill suddenly became a vital necessity. So also was it in the wilderness. When a war is on the horizon, the aristocratic and the oligarchic principle disappears in the face of the democratic and representative. Because only if the tribes feel involved in the fight, only if they feel their existence and their reality has been taken seriously, that their states have been treated with respect, will they become involved and participate creatively. And even as is possibly the case, the 12 tribes are not literally the descendants of the sons of Jacob, but are idealized round numbers of the origin of our people. Nevertheless, the democratic principle, as opposed to the oligarchic, aristocratic, and sacerdotal principle, is manifest. Again, what we might well describe as the naturalistic, or the humanistic, or the realistic nature of the verses and the chapters that we read in our Sidra is manifest in the questionnaire which the spies are expected to fill in. This also smacks of the reality of life. They are asked to ascertain what kind of a land it is, what the people are like. Is it a strong people? What armaments do they possess? What kind of an army do they have? Is the land a good land? What is the soil like? What are the harvests like? Is it a good or a bad land? Is it fat or lean? What is the produce? Bring back some specimens. It is amazing, and it is a paradox, that the Bible, which is full of the Jews believing in God, Vayaminu Barunai in the collective, and Vehemin Barunai, he believed in God of Abraham, the individual, suddenly that faith leaves them at the 11th hour before the battle of possession of entry into Canaan. And although God has promised them that the land is flowing with milk and honey, they would like a few grapes just to see whether God is just talking out of his yarmulke, as it were, or whether indeed this is and this is exactly the way people behave in shul today. They talk big when they sign their checks and when they pray, but when the chips are down and it's an issue whether their children should have a good Jewish education or whether some hunky-dory private school should take precedence, the reality of their religious commitment suddenly becomes terribly transparent. And the questions they begin to ask about the future suddenly become much more reality-grounded than the theoretical idealistic slogans they have been accustomed to coming out with in previous years. Rabbis know of this syndrome. We come across it a great deal, but it is most impolitic to spell it out in too great detail. But here we have our ancestors who have been promised by God, believe in me, we believe, boss, and I'm going to give you a land flowing with milk and honey. Yeah, yeah, hallelujah. And then on the borders of the promised land, suddenly God is forgotten, the shul is forgotten, and Moses gets together and says, look here, boys, let's find out what's cooking over there, because we don't want to spill any blood unnecessarily. Never mind about this faith in God. The reality is now, the chips are now down. And so the 13th and the 14th chapters of the book of Numbers become an ancient variation on the more recent theme of put your trust in God, boys, but keep your powder dry. More suitable for a modern engagement than one which we are given to believe by tradition is in the framework of a pre-modern, supernaturalistic grounded universe. More than anything, the reactions of the 12 men to their assignments underline the reality situation of the story. And here again, in the way in which the 12 tribes sent to Canaan return and give their impressions to the Jewish people, to the children of Israel, where they return, that again underlines what I call the naturalistic or the humanistic, as opposed to the commonly regarded supernaturalistic dimension of the story of the spies. God suddenly seems to be remarkably reticent. He is nowhere to be seen. He has gone into hiding. Our ancestors carry on very much the same as the modern secular men described in newspapers and books of our own day, novels, plays, etc. 12 men go and spy out the same country. They enter it by the same route. They observe the same phenomena. They have all been briefed in the same fashion. Yet 10 of them return convinced that Canaan will never be overcome by the children of Israel. Only 2 of them believe that the children of Israel will be able to conquer Canaan, and this leads the people to clamor for an immediate return to Egypt with a great deal of panic and a great deal of defeatism. Joshua and Caleb alone plead that the land is a good land and that the children of Israel will conquer the land, but their voices go unheeded. At this point in the story, having missed all the juicy pieces, as it were, God suddenly returns to do what he always seemed to be doing, saying, no, you won't go into the promised land. you will wander in the wilderness for 40 years. His presence, a few verses earlier, might have prevented this terrible conclusion, had he only interposed his own divine, supernatural, omniscient comments in the discussion as to whether the people would be able to conquer the land. Now, we should not be too surprised that our sacred literature, the Bible, the Torah, constantly affords evidence that our ancestors, on some level of their minds, were as keenly aware as we are of the nature of the universe in which they lived. After all, it happens to be the identical universe. All that has changed between the time of the Bible and our time is man's understanding of the universe. The universe hasn't changed. Now, of course, our forebears were neither naturalists, nor humanists, nor reconstructionists. They could not be in terms of the age in which they lived. Their overall viewpoint differed radically from ours by virtue of their position in the history of human evolution. It is a case of our ancestors, in writing down the Bible, knowing more than they wrote, knowing more than they said, and saying more than they knew. We have this phenomenon in the modern world, and it shows light, it casts light on the biblical phenomenon. In the first volume of his collected writings, Freud describes how 3 doctors he knew separately and independently described to him the origin of neurotic behavior, on which he based his entire theory. But these men were not aware of what they were saying. They were saying something which would only become important to someone who was looking for that which they were saying. Freud was looking for confirmation of his own theory. And these 3 doctors, who said quite clearly things which link up with Freud's own theories, were not aware of what they were saying, but Freud understood. A grown man, like a child, can often say things without realizing the true significance. Someone else listening with a different set of assumptions grasps the true significance. It is the same with the people, and with what a people utters, especially as embodied in its sacred literature. Some of the things our ancestors said were not fully understood by them. We can understand what they said more clearly than they did. We can bring out from their sayings implications they would not even have recognized and certainly would not have agreed with. So we detect humanist, naturalistic, reconstructionist tendencies in that ancient literature of ours known as the Torah or the Bible. And they are not anachronisms. They are things said of which those who spoke were not aware of the true significance. Only a later stage, such as ours, can fully understand the true import and significance. In the last resort, the bond which links us with the Torah is precisely the fact that it was written by human beings like ourselves. Regarding the Torah, which is our childhood diary as a people, we hear ourselves speaking as children, not entirely aware of what we are saying in our reactions to the universe. And the prime example of our ancestors saying more than they knew is found in the reactions of the spies to the same facts which they discovered in the Promised Land, in the way in which 10 of the spies came back with a negative report, and 2 came back with a positive report, and the way in which those who came back with a negative report managed to spread panic and disaffection among the whole house of Israel. This most important phenomenon is a phenomenon and a process in human life whose dynamics we have only recently begun to understand in its powers for good and evil. We now see more clearly that the different reactions of the spies relate not to what they saw in Canaan, but rather to what they brought with them into Canaan. They were already, the 10 spies who came back with a negative report, they were already predisposed to arrive at their negative conclusions. The 10 who rejected the Promised Land were possessed of the slave mentality, which had plagued the people intermittently ever since the exodus from Egypt. And that slave mentality they brought into Canaan with them. They could not see themselves rising to the challenge of entering into their heritage. It would involve too much effort. A slave prefers to have things done for him as a person rather than to do things for himself. Joshua and Caleb alone, who, having learnt from Moses the true spirit of freedom, entered into Canaan with a sense of conscious resolution, determined to win through come what may. And Joshua and Caleb accordingly saw truly not only a promised land, but a land of promise. The measure of this divergence of opinion between the 10 and the 2 is found in the effect which the report of the 10 has on the people. In a matter of moments, from a people expectantly poised on the brink of achieving a long-term, long-waited-for goal, there is a transition to a rebellious, disgruntled, dissatisfied mob. Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, suddenly the children of Israel say. The children of Israel who were a moment ago anticipating eagerly entering into the promised land. All of a sudden, because a handful of people have come back and said, it's no good, we'll never make it. Would that we had died in the wilderness, this formerly highly optimistic people shouts. Why did God bring us into this terrible land? To kill our wives and our children by the sword. This is the God who has redeemed the children of Israel from Egypt. God is now accused as the murderer of the Jewish people. We are all going to be destroyed. Would it not be better if we all returned to Egypt, to be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, rather than to have to fight for entering the promised land? And they said one to another, let us elect a leader who will help us to return to Egypt. Supreme example of the way a handful of negative spies can demoralize a whole people, and how we all know in our own personal lives how creative those people are who say to us, yes, you can do it, yes, you will do it. How this elicits the best from us, and how those niggling, mealy-mouthed people who are always criticizing and saying, no, you can't do it, and what you're doing is no good, it's not as good as the other man did, how they demoralize us and make us produce less than we would have produced if they had left us alone in the first instance. There is a rabbinic story which says that for every blade of grass that grows in the fields, there is an angel somewhere in heaven which keeps on shouting, grow, grow, grow tall, grow strong. And this is a beautiful idea, that even nature itself cannot yield and cannot produce unless there is love. And how much more so in the sphere of individual life and collective life. Now, this ancient story from our Torah has recently been given a theoretical foundation. In the work of scholars and scientists such as Anatole Rappaport, in his work in operational philosophy, I'd like to quote to you this morning a story from this book by this operational philosopher, which will throw light on the problem of what happens when spies enter into Canaan with negative assumptions beforehand, and the process whereby they not only bring back the conclusions they already anticipated before they entered Canaan, more importantly, how their reactions will negatively affect those who never went there in the first place. Namely, how people who go into a situation feeling negative and who elicit negative reactions in themselves will also elicit negative reactions in the public. And Anatole Rappaport, especially in his book Operational Philosophy, clearly articulates what the ancients could only intuit in the Sidra of Shalach Lecha, namely, that if you go into the promised land, whether that promised land is Eretz Yisrael or any project that you are entering into in life, which means what the promised land means, if you go into the promised land, convinced before you start that you are not going to get there, not only won't you get there, more importantly, other people on your account won't get there. Rappaport draws a distinction between two kinds of self-fulfilling assumptions. Subjective self-fulfilling assumptions and objective self-fulfilling assumptions. Let me give you an example of subjective self-fulfilling assumptions. The farmer missed a sum of money and began to suspect that his neighbor's son had stolen the money. He began to observe the boy closely and was soon convinced that the boy was the thief, for the boy's eyes were furtive and his manner was stealthy. Sometimes afterwards, however, the farmer found the money where he had mislaid it. And when he saw his neighbor's son again, suddenly the boy looked at him straight in the eye. His manner was open, honest, and friendly. Now, one explanation immediately suggests itself. The farmer saw in the boy's behavior what he wanted to see in it, or what he was afraid he would see in it. This, according to Rappaport, illustrates the working of what he calls subjectively self-realizing assumptions. Of course, we all know that preconceived notions and prejudices distort the world. But science, Rappaport argues, ought to be able to be a little more precise about these assumptions. Is it only that the farmer in his own mind believed that the boy was looking furtive and shifty as a thief might look? Well, says Rappaport, let us take hundreds of photographs before and after the believed act of theft. And then after the farmer has found the money where he placed it, let us put these hundreds of photographs in front of the farmer. If the farmer can clearly make no distinction between before and after, except with that kind of random error which would be common to any experiment of this kind, then we could clearly say to the farmer, we have scientifically demonstrated that the furtive eyes, the shifty look of the so-called thief were all in your mind. The boy did not look like a thief. The boy was not a thief. And the fact that you immediately believed he looked at you in the eyes after you discovered the money was the figment of your imagination. This was a self-fulfilling assumption. You believed the boy was the thief, and you removed that belief only when you found the money. But there is also, Rappaport goes on, an objective side to self-realizing assumptions. For it is possible that if the farmer thought that the son of the neighbor was a thief, he may have been harsh with him. He may have been short with him. He may have spoken to him in a kind of a half-hearted way, a suspicious way, and the boy might have begun to wonder what the farmer was thinking of. And the boy in turn might have avoided the farmer's eyes under the latter's suspicious scrutiny. Possibly also, once the farmer found the money, his own attitude towards the boy changed. He became warmer and more friendly, and so the boy changed in his manner. It is possible, writes Rappaport, that people under constant suspicion do finally commit the acts they are suspected of. The proverb, "Give the dog a bad name and hang him," thus may be interpreted as referring both to subjective and to objective aspects of self-realizing assumptions. A bad name will not only spoil a man's reputation, it may spoil the man himself. Verbalizations can influence the course of events. And this is precisely what happens in the Torah reading today. We are faced in our Torah reading with a study in self-realizing assumptions. Not only are the negative reactions to Canaan grounded in the minds of the 10 spies who think that, as it were, their money has been stolen, they adversely, in their report, affect the objectivity of the people. There can be no doubt but that this problem, related almost unwittingly by our ancestors, and given theoretical foundation in scholars and scientists of operational philosophy, is one of the most vital problems facing our modern society today. For every man who has the intelligence and the insight to look beyond what is in the modern world to what ought to be and what might be, is in a sense a spy on a vital intelligence mission into the brave new world of the future. Everything depends upon the attitudes which we undertake this adventure into the unknown. Everything depends upon the self-realizing assumptions we carry with us. There are those who claim to have penetrated into this promised land and who bring back reports which strike terror into the hearts of those of us left behind. Such a report was Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, George Orwell's 1984, to some extent William Golding's Lord of the Flies, and to some extent also some of the secularist, pessimistic, pagan theologians who look at a world in which God is dead and say there is very little hope for the future. All we can do is huddle together around the dying embers of our ethnic historic civilizations and console each other in the thought that one day we will all be dead. There are 1,001 variations on this theme from the pen and the minds of men who claim to have visited and spied out the promised land of the future. And in one way or another, they all say to us that man is essentially an animal whose passions will always outstrip his reason, that in the long run the only future for the human race will be a life that is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is not surprising that in the wake of the contemporary philosophies of life, which constantly harp on human frailty, on man's essentially tragic condition, on his alienation, on his basic inability to cope with the problems of life by himself, once again we hear the cry of the wilderness, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt, back to slavery, back to a state in which others decide for us, anything but freedom to choose. Now, no one can prove that there can ever be a world in which peace and creative cooperation will prevail among men. No one can prove that that kind of world will ever be a reality, but then no one can ever disprove it. Huxley and Orwell and Golding and some of our pagan theologians and death of God theologians and some of our science fiction writers may be right, or they may be wrong. What arises out of our analysis of the Torah today and the theoretical articulation of its insights by a modern scientist is that although we cannot prove the validity of the promised land one way or another and its possibility, we can seriously affect our chances of ever approaching it, if it does exist, by the assumptions we hold about man, about God, about human society, and about the universe. Give the dog a bad name and hang him. Then of a surety, give man, give society, give the cosmos a bad name, and we will all hang ourselves. And that is what the 10 spies did for Canaan. The generation of the wilderness wandered 40 years through the desert and never saw the promised land. They all died. And this kind of death is the price we pay, not for being Pollyannish, not for avoiding looking reality in the face, but for looking reality in the face with the wrong assumptions and preconceived notions. There may be something naive in Joshua saying, quite simply, Tovah ha'aretz, the land is a very good land. Of course there are difficulties to overcome. Of course there are battles to be fought. And of course many will fall by the way. But these very obstacles must be approached in a positive spirit if we are not to be doomed from the outset to failure. To each and every one of us living in an age of crisis, the opening words of our Sidra come to us as a timely challenge. Shalach anashim, send men to spy out the land. We are all called upon not only to bring back from our intellectual and spiritual reconnoitering realistic appraisal of what might be expected in the course of our context of the promised land, we are also called upon to go about that task in that manner and with those attitudes calculated to strengthen our own arms and the arms of all those whose lives touch ours in what surely can become a truly heroic, creative, and glorious enterprise. Amen.